Good afternoon. Welcome to Voices webinar, State Budget Choices, FY14 and Beyond. I'm Paula Corrigan-Halpern, Voices Policy Advocacy Director. And we're glad to have you participate in today's conversation that's going to be led by David Lloyd, a Senior Policy Analyst with Voices Fiscal Policy Center. We are 6 weeks out from the scheduled end of the General Assembly session. Budget negotiations are gathering steam. The House Appropriations Committee hearings were held. The Senate Appropriations Committees are wrapping up their hearings. We know that there are preliminary House Committee allocations were floated last week before House members left for the week. And as we all suspected, and those of us who have been around for the last couple years know each year, it's not looking very pretty for the services that are critical to the people of Illinois. We're holding this webinar because now is the time to understand not only how Illinois came to this place, the structural issues that are contributing to the state fiscal crisis, but also, most importantly, in the last 6 weeks of this session, what we can do about it. At Voices, our priority is that the approach to restoring Illinois' fiscal health is balanced, fair, and does not put our children's and our state's future at risk. Advocating for additional revenue, letting legislators know that the decisions they make are choices. These are important components to our work in the next couple of weeks. So we're glad to be able to listen together, to have this webinar, and to leave with concrete ideas and strategies. I want to talk about a couple of the housekeeping details. You are muted. We can't hear you. You'll be able to hear us as we walk through the webinar and the slides. You do have the ability to send us questions. We're going to hold questions to the end, but we have given plenty of time during this presentation for questions. All you need to do is to type your question. You should see a box at the end of your screen. To the right-hand side, you'll have a column. You can type your question there. I'll be able to look at it and either read it directly, or if we're getting several questions on the same topics, I'll condense them and make sure that they get answered. If that's not working for you, you can always email me your question. You can email me at paula@voicesforkids.org. So that's paula@voices4kids.org. The preferred choice is please use that box on your screen, or if that doesn't work, just email me, and we will make sure that those questions are considered and then have a chance to answer them during our conversation. With that said, I'm now going to turn it over to David Lloyd, who's going to lead us through the presentation.
Well, thank you, Paula, and thank you all for joining us today. We're really thrilled to have you here, and we've had a robust turnout, so we're heartened by the interest that people are taking in this issue. So today we're looking at, as Paula said, kind of the state budget choices, both for this next fiscal year, which starts on July 1 for 2014, and beyond. So basically, first we'll look at quickly what we'll cover for the next half hour or so, and then after your questions, we'll look at the basics of the Illinois budget, a very, very top-line view. Secondly, we'll look at the impact and origins of the state fiscal crisis. We'll then look at the FY 2014 budget debate and ways to avoid more harm in FY 2014. And we'll also look at ways to create a sustainable budget beyond this next fiscal year. And so just looking at the budget basics for the Illinois state budget quickly, the governor's proposed budget for this year is, when you look at both the general funds and non-general funds, is a total of $62.4 billion. And essentially half the budget is in the general funds, which is usually what what most people are talking about when they talk about the state budget. And the other half, though, is in non-general funds, outside of the general funds. And as this graphic shows, the non-general funds is composed of a number of different items. They're special state funds, they're federal funds that the state gets, they're funds for debt service, and also highway funds. And so here's a quick look at the agency kind of breakdown of the 2013 enacted budget. And this is general funds operating appropriations by agency. And so the two biggest agencies in terms of general fund spending are the State Board of Education at about 22%, and the Department of Health Care and Family Services, which has most of the medical assistance programs in the state of Illinois at 23%. I also took out pension contributions separated those out from the state agencies, and as you can see, they're significant in the past fiscal year at 17%. And so this gives you a pretty good sense of kind of where, at least in the general funds, where the overall money goes. And now we'll take a quick look at the Illinois fiscal crisis. Obviously, we've all lived through this, and so we're probably painfully aware of the effects. We'll quickly kind of go over it just as a review. And so one aspect of the state fiscal crisis are the $1 billion in unpaid bills. And this chart basically shows at the end of each fiscal year how much does the state have in back bills. And as you can see in FY 2009, it started out at about $5 billion at the end of that fiscal year, kind of the heart of the economic crisis. It grew in FY 10, it's kind of gone up and down. But in FY 2013, we've actually made a little bit of progress in paying down the unpaid bills. It's still nowhere near acceptable, but it's projected by the end of FY 13, so basically the end of June, the state will have reduced the backlog by $1.2 billion. And here is a look at the percentages cut since FY 09, which for most programs was the kind of the high water point for spending. And you can see that this is for the Department of Human Services, and these are the general funds cuts. And as you can see, there's kind of a sea of red. Prenatal care was cut by 20%, Teen Reach was cut by 54%, community mental health services by 27%. Kind of across the line, there have been cuts, which have been very damaging to human services in Illinois and the people who we all really care, very deeply about, and the residents of Illinois and their well-being. And so this next slide just simply looks at the State Board of Education cuts since FY 09. And overall, the State Board of Education has been cut by a little over 10% since FY 09. But the Early Childhood Block Grant, which funds state-funded preschool and also services for infants and toddlers, was cut by about 21% since FY 09. And the result of this has been that in the current fiscal year, more than about 20,000 fewer kids have access to state-funded preschool than was the case in in FY 09. And this is not that's not a cumulative number. That this year is 20,000 fewer students. So if we basically maintain level funding for next year, more students next year will again have lost funding versus the high watermark in FY 09. So we're really, there are a lot of kids who aren't attending preschool because of funding cuts. And then also, general state aid, which is the primary source of funding to local school districts, has been cut, as has bilingual education and student transportation. And so how did this happen is kind of a natural question. The obvious answer is that we had a huge fiscal crisis, but if you dig a little bit more, the story gets a little bit more robust, so to speak. And so if we look at this graph, which if we look at just kind of the cash balances at the end of each fiscal year, it looks like from basically 1990 to 2012 that the general funds balances are positive. So from this point of view, things look like the state was doing pretty well. But when you look at things, if you look at the budget on a budgetary basis, and after the lapse, and the lapse is agencies currently have 2 months after the end of the fiscal year to spend money that was appropriated in that prior fiscal year. And so you really see that throughout that time, Illinois was often running structural budget deficits, which is a major problem if you want to really fund investments in the future and have something that can continue on into the future. And also another cause of kind of the pre-recession structural deficits, which I just showed, is that Illinois, like many states, has there's been lagging revenue growth that hasn't, when we did have economic growth from 2000 to 2008, that state personal income increased about 4.2% annually, but general funds revenue from state sources increased about 3.3% annually. So you can see there's a little bit of a gap there, which adds up over time. There's also a narrow sales tax base, which this relates to the first bullet above. And in Illinois, the sales tax was designed when there were much fewer services, and so that it applies to mostly goods, and it exempts many goods at that. And so with the economy shifting more towards services, the narrow sales tax is increasingly a problem. And, importantly, it's not, for the most part, the state kind of what I call kind of discretionary spending, spending on education and other liabilities that don't necessarily grow automatically. That has not been to blame. That is not to blame for these structural deficits. They basically grew at the same rate as the overall economy. And so it's also important to look at tax expenditures, which are basically exemptions from the tax code. And this chart is from the Illinois Office of the Comptroller and shows that the biggest tax expenditure at about $1.5 billion in fiscal year 2011 was exemptions for certain food items, prescription drugs, and medical appliances. And then second, in Illinois, retirement income is excluded from the state personal income tax. And so many of these things are very popular. So I think few people want to tax all food or want to eliminate the standard deduction, which is defined as a tax expenditure, or want to reduce the earned income tax credit. So it's many of these are very popular. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that the expenditures for the tax expenditures for drugs, medical appliances, and retirement income, as the population ages, those may well increase over time. And then, finally, Illinois, in terms of retirement income, is one of two states that exempts all retirement income from taxation. So, I'm not necessarily proposing that we tax this, but I think we should look at all these items and see whether they make sense or whether these resources could be put to better use. And we now reach pensions, which is really a tragic story in Illinois. The state has chronically underfunded pensions in Illinois, and this chart basically looks at the increases, or basically the change in unfunded liabilities between 1996 and 2012. And as you could see, inadequate employer contributions were by far the most important source of the increase in unfunded liabilities. Also important were between 1996 and 2012, they assumed certain investment returns on the assets in the funds, and those assumed rate of returns were not borne out in practice. So that adds to the unfunded liability. And the unfunded liability, that in the mid-1990s, the state set itself, passed a statute that set, a funding schedule, for the next 50 years, and which takes into account the unfunded liabilities. And so this is a graph that shows the increases in pension costs from 2008 to 2014, projected in 2014. And so you can see there's a clear increase both in the pension contributions and pension-related debt service, which when the state issued pension obligation bonds in several years to pay for that year's pension contributions that the state owed. And so this is really a very steep increase. And this year, the combined pension contributions to pension cost and pension-related debt service, rather, is increasing by over $1 billion. And so this slide basically shows this story kind of playing out. It's the pension cost as a percentage of general funds revenue from state sources. And so in FY08 it was 8.3%, and it's projected in next fiscal year to be over 25%. So that's it's tripled the proportion of general funds revenue from state sources over the past 6 years. Which this is a major problem because it really crowds out a lot of other priorities. Now, of course, the economic collapse, and this is a very significant item, caused revenue to plummet as people earned less, as people lost their jobs. They paid less in taxes, and so in FY09, receipts came in at $2.1 billion below FY08 levels, and that's before the federal stimulus kicked in. Luckily, the federal government kicked in about $1.6 billion, so that helped close some of the gap, but it was still a major gap that the state had. And then in FY 2010, things didn't get better. It was still $2.6 billion below FY08 levels in FY 2010. So that's very, very significant revenue collapse for the state. And so now we kind of come to, a lot of people will ask, well, what about, the state did X, or they did Y, and that didn't work. That didn't solve the crisis. So we'll look at a couple of those items really quickly. One is the increased income tax rates. A lot of people have said that we increased the income tax rates and it hasn't solved the crisis, so therefore we shouldn't have done it, which I think is doesn't really look at the evidence. The increased revenue from the increase in income tax rates was really essential to preventing a full-scale free fall for the state. And this chart, very simply looks at the revenue raised each year from the increase in rates, both on the individual and the corporate side, and then just adds them up for each year. So as you can see, the estimates show that through projected through the end of this fiscal year, it will have raised $17 billion. So if you can imagine what the state would have had to do without that $17 billion, either unpaid bills would have skyrocketed further, or there would have been additional huge rounds of cuts, much, much worse than already have occurred. Although in reality, it probably would be likely some combination of both. So, as I said, the increasing revenue avoided even more draconian cuts and an increase in unpaid bills. And after the increase, rating agencies actually improved Illinois' overall rating outlook, which was, people pay a lot of attention to what the bond rating agencies say, and that was at some level at that point in time a small vote of confidence. And so now, we'll look at what has been called Medicaid stabilization, the so-called SMART Act that was passed last spring, which cut Medicaid costs and benefits and had some cost savings for Medicaid. And so Medicaid, again, it's been severely underfunded. Had a long history of severe underfunding, and that continued in FY 2012. Governor Quinn said that he wanted to avoid further increasing the Medicaid backlog, and so he called for level funding for Medicaid in 2013, in his 2013 budget proposal, even though Medicaid costs were kind of naturally growing. And that gap was $2.7 billion, so a very significant gap between expected program costs and proposed level of funding that he proposed. And the result was the SMART Act passed by the General Assembly, which included $1.6 billion in program cuts and other cost savings, $1.1 billion of which are expected to be realized in the current fiscal year. There was also additional revenue from the cigarette tax increase and related federal matching funds of about $675 million. And then there was a supplemental appropriation to reduce the FY12 shortfall of about $300 million, which includes the federal match. And Medicaid program liabilities are expected to increase this year by about 4%. And so now, finally, we get to the FY14 budget debate, what you've all been waiting for. And so we think there are several key factors driving the debate. First of all, the pension cost increases. There's been a lot of talk about it, and it's projected. The projected increases in costs are over $300 million more than the increase in revenue from state sources. So there's already there's already a hole that's kind of built in. There's also, as I alluded to just a second ago, rising healthcare costs. Healthcare is, of course, vital. But rising costs put pressure on the rest of the budget, which is an issue that we have to address, or at least deal with. And Governor Quinn's budget sets aside an additional $257 million from the General Revenue Fund to pay for increasing medical costs. There's also the large backlog of unpaid bills, currently about $8 billion. At the current rate of paying it off, it would take many years to eliminate the backlog. And then there's still general resistance to additional revenue among many members of the General Assembly, which being out there in the trenches, talking with them, we run into on a regular basis. And so the big question for FY14 is, if there are no additional resources made available, what areas will be cut or underfunded? And so this looks at, I think I had a little error here, so it'll take me just a sec to get back up. There we go. Just 1 second. PowerPoint doesn't like me today. Okay. I think we're all back up and running. So here's the governor's proposal for FY, and these were how different agencies fared versus the enacted budget for FY 2013. And as you can see, that he has proposed deep cuts to the State Board of Education, as well as higher education, but he has increases for a number of other items, including Department of Corrections, state employee group insurance, which are the insurance plans for state employees, which have been underfunded numerous times in the past. There's also increased funding for healthcare and the Department of Healthcare and Family Services. That's mostly the medical expenses, including Medicaid. There's an increase for the Department of Human Services, and there's also an increase for the Department on Aging. And so the governor's zooming in a little bit closer on the education cuts. This is a chart showing the State Board of Education, the general fund budget, for FY13, the revised budget versus the governor's proposed budget. And as you can see, general state aid under his budget would take a big hit of a decrease of $150 million, or 3.5%. Also, a big hit would come to transportation reimbursements for local school districts, about $145 million. That's a 71% decrease. And school districts would have to decide whether they wanted to basically decrease transportation or whether they wanted to try to absorb that, that decrease of funding into their budget. And that's very difficult when general state aid is being cut at the same time. And so overall, the general funds cut under the governor's budget would be about $310 million, or about 4.7%. And if those cuts were enacted, this would leave the agency about $1.1 billion below FY09 levels. So one area of increase is to the Department of Human Services, about $340 million in General Revenue Fund appropriations under the governor's proposal. This includes about $103 million for a new AFSCME contract and the hiring of 800 additional staff to handle new applications and enhanced eligibility verification for Medicaid applicants. Part of this is associated, the enhanced eligibility verification is associated with the SMART Act. The new applications are associated with the Federal Affordable Care Act. There's also a $136 million increase in grants to community-based agencies, and 128 of that would go to developmental disability services. 84 million would go to home services programs for people with physical disabilities, and there would also be $36 million to pay unpaid bills to service providers. There would also, unfortunately, be, when you combine the General Revenue Fund and non-General Revenue Fund grants for community mental health services, there would be a net cut overall of $13 million. There would also be small increases, well, relatively small, not small necessarily for the programs, but in the grand absolute sense. Early intervention, the governor proposes $7.8 million. Child Care Assistance Program will get $11 million, and Redeploy Illinois will get $2.5 million increase under Governor Quinn's proposal. And so the Department on Aging is notable for its increase as well. The Community Care Program is driving much of the increased expenditures. As I noted, a $400 million increase under the governor's budget proposal. That's more than 50%. And more than 90% of the Department on Aging's budget it goes to the Community Care Program, which provides services for seniors who might otherwise need nursing home care. So, in many ways, it's a very, very worthwhile program to keep seniors out of nursing homes. But at the same time, the program participation has more than doubled in the past 8 years. And that's just something to note. I don't want to make a comment on one way or another. But certainly, with the aging of the population, program participation has been increasing, which has been driving more state resources to the Department on Aging. And the governor's proposal also includes reduced transfers from the general funds to funds outside of the general funds, which of course would leave more resources inside the general funds. So in FY13, statutory transfers from the general funds were, sorry, one quick, just one sec. I lost PowerPoint is giving me some problems today. Sorry about that. So getting back, so in FY 2013, the statutory transfers from the general funds were $2.9 billion. The governor wants to reduce these transfers by about $164 million this year. A number of funds which are listed and the bullets would be reduced to FY12 levels. One fund, the Partners for Conservation Fund, will get no transfer in FY 2014. And so now let's turn to the House and Senate proposals, which kind of are still in the works and don't, still to be determined results. But what is clear that without additional revenues beyond COGFA's revenue estimate, something must be cut or underfunded. And COGFA, for those of you who might not know, is the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability. So the House wants to pay off, we've been told, at least $800 million in unpaid bills, which was the amount they set aside for the current fiscal year. It's not possible to do this without cutting agency spending if the state is going to fully fund all the liabilities that automatically increase, for example, pensions and Medicaid. So, the question is, will the General Assembly once again cut Medicaid? Will they cut other programs? Will they underfund state employee group insurance, which they've done in the past? And House Appropriation Committee chairs, there are 5 of them, have been told that they will receive an allocation for their committees 1% below FY 2013 levels, and it could possibly be as much as 2.4% lower for the Human Services Appropriations Committee if the supplemental is not accounted for. And this, the reduced allocation amount would basically be put aside and reserved for possible appropriation at the end of the budget process. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that the allocation is being reduced because it builds in some flexibility. But when the committees are crafting their budget, they will have to take their allocations into account. And so, avoiding further harm in 2014, there really is, there's a gap between available resources and the needed investments in our future. And for Voices for Illinois Children, we certainly think that this is very true with respect to children. So after pension contributions and other increasing liabilities are taken into account, there's little room to increase investments in our future. As I mentioned earlier, Illinois has an kind of antiquated sales tax system and has significant tax expenditures. We simply need more resources. One area we should look, one of the first slides, if you remember, was the 50-50 split in the overall budget between the general funds and the non-general funds. And so we should look outside the general funds and utilize resources that are there. Because the general funds are, after all, only about half the budget. The cuts over the past few years have mostly focused on the general funds because that is where most of the attention is paid. And, that is really, at some level, unfair. And there are hundreds of other state funds outside of the general funds that are really scrutinized. And dozens of these carry balances of over $1 million year after year. And so, we should give them, we should scrutinize some of them. Many also get automatic transfers from the general funds each year that are written in the statute. Well, some are written in the statute, others just occur because they're appropriated, regardless of need. So, it's important, these, again, are areas we should look at. And so we think the General Assembly should authorize transfers from funds outside the general funds with large ongoing surplus back into the general funds to make them available for appropriation to avoid further harm. We also think that we should stop automatic transfers out of the general funds to funds that do not need additional resources. And the bottom line is, sacrifice needs to be shared, and that it's not, we should not allow funds to have resources just sit idle when the rest of the budget is struggling and taking cuts. So another item in terms of making more resources available are possibly closing tax loopholes. Governor Quinn and Senator Troy Hutchinson have both proposed this. SB 1159 is her bill. One would require what's called combined reporting for all Illinois corporations. And combined reporting is when you have a parent corporation and then you have subsidiaries, it requires them to combine their income and report it on one income tax return. And doing this basically helps prevent tax avoidance because corporations, if without combined reporting, they can transfer some of their income to subsidiaries in low tax jurisdictions to avoid taxation. and it's estimated that this would raise about $25 million this year. Another loophole is not allowing corporations to use the federal domestic production activity deduction to lower Illinois taxes. Essentially, this is within the federal code that was put in place, I think, in the mid-2000s, I think 2004, which was to encourage production activity within the U.S. And there are a broad range of activities that qualify, that qualify as a domestic production activity. But since Illinois' corporate income tax is connected with the federal tax code, when the federal government does something like this, the General Assembly doesn't have to vote on it for it to be passed down to Illinois. And it's also, this one doesn't make much sense because if a corporation invests in another state, say Ohio or Kentucky or Indiana, that will lower their tax bill in Illinois. It just doesn't make much sense. We should be, if we want to incentivize production through the tax code, we should at least make sure that it happens in Illinois. Governor Quinn has also proposed taxing foreign dividends, and this would raise a significant amount of money. It's not clear how much traction this has, but it would raise over $300 million according to the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. And we should also keep in mind that the Senate passed legislation last year to close corporate loopholes on offshore oil drilling and satellite TV providers, which are not taxed in the same way as cable television providers. And this would have raised about $175 million in fiscal year 2013, the current fiscal year. And there's actually some low-hanging fruit in terms of not letting resources sit idle. And one has to do with what's called the Income Tax Refund Fund. And essentially, when money comes in to the state in terms of income tax revenue, some of it, a percentage of it gets set aside into the Income Tax Refund Fund to make sure that they can pay refunds that are later due. And so it's expected that there'll be a surplus in the range of $155 million at the end of the current fiscal year in the refund fund. While this will automatically be transferred into the general fund, that won't happen until likely after the budget has been approved by the General Assembly. So we think that the General Assembly should basically count this as money available for appropriation. Additionally, we think that the General Assembly should consider reducing the percentages of income tax receipts that are diverted to the refund fund. The Department of Revenue and the governor has a proposal which would lower these percentages, and the Department of Revenue says that this can safely be done, and doing so would raise, well, it wouldn't raise, but it would prevent the diversion of about $200 million from the general funds. There's also, the governor has proposed transferring $186 million from the state gaming fund, which the legislature, at one point in time, there was an idea that this should go to the Horse Racing Equity Fund. I won't bore you with all the details of this, but it was never appropriated the Horse Racing Equity Fund. So the governor has proposed transferring $186 million back to the general funds. And all told, these three items would make available about $540 million in resources to either pay back the backlog of unpaid bills and/or reduce harmful cuts. Now, this is a very tough issue, kind of enacting pension changes, which the General Assembly has been considering. But overall, there are very few good options. So the 5 state-funded retirement systems are about $90 billion underfunded at this point. And it's important to point out that the General Assembly is mostly to blame for this, and it's not the workers. It's not the state workers. Also, we should not forget that we're talking about people's retirement income. Voices has some principles for pension legislation that the legislation should address both the short-term and long-term funding issues. It should maintain adequate retirement income for public employees, because that's very important. And it should also be, the state should also construct a balanced approach that takes into account the interests of all Illinoisans. And then looking at the, we think we should issue bonds to pay providers, and this would make a dent in the backlog of unpaid bills. There's legislation to do this. Would authorize $2.5 billion in borrowing. About $2 billion would go to healthcare bills. There'd be a federal match, would then be used to pay down principal. $500 million would go to human services providers. And this would really replace unwilling borrowers with willing borrowers. And providers deserve to be paid, and there's also a question of making sure that we maintain this, this important infrastructure for government-funded service delivery. And it's important to remember, though, that this item would not really do anything to improve the state's overall financial position. This borrowing still has to be repaid with interest. So I'm going to go quickly now. I think I've PowerPoint difficulties set me behind a little bit. So there is a looming disaster beyond 2014. If the current income tax rates expire, it will be very damaging to the state. In this graph, the red line, we're currently in just the red line portion of this graph, and it shows how much money was raised above what would have been raised under the previous tax rates. So as you can see, there was a big increase when tax rates increased, and then now there's kind of natural growth going on. But that natural growth will plummet when tax rates mostly go back to previous levels at the end of 2014, and we'll lose all this revenue. And we did some calculations on this, and based on COGFA data, we would lose close to $60 billion in lost revenue if we don't maintain current income tax rates through fiscal year 2024. And even if you were to enact very aggressive pension legislation, and that legislation were held constitutional, the budget would likely remain structurally unsound if the current tax rates are not maintained and you lose all this revenue. And also, huge cuts are likely if revenue is not maintained beyond the end of 2014. So, if current income tax rates are maintained, but there are no pension changes, we have some choices. Really, there are only two levers you can pull to create a sustainable budget. One is to raise billions of dollars in additional revenue beyond just maintaining kind of current, the current path of maintaining the current growth in revenue with current rates, or you can have deep cuts to program areas. And these are very difficult choices, particularly given the reluctance among many in the General Assembly to raise additional revenue. And so in conclusion, we want to prevent more damage in FY 2014. We want to use resources wisely from outside the general funds to either pay back bills or fund programs. We think that sacrifice must be shared. We need to stop unnecessary transfers out of the general funds. We don't want resources to needlessly sit idle. This includes the income tax refund issues that I talked about and the possible transfers from the state gaming fund. We think we should close tax loopholes, at least look at that seriously. And both the governor's proposal and the FY13 Senate proposal are things to look at. And then we should issue $2.5 billion in bonds to pay service providers. Although, it is likely that, when members have been talking about this, they've, been saying that many feel like they need to have that paired with significant pension changes. So you have to keep that in mind depending on where you may stand on pension changes. And in the end, these are difficult choices, but I think, eventually the math wins. Without additional revenues, to pay the liabilities such as pensions and Medicaid, Illinois will be forced to cut other programs. There's just no way around it. If you want to increase program spending in order to invest in our future, you must either raise significant amounts of new additional revenue or reduce other expenditures accordingly. On the current path, which includes the expiration of the income tax rates and increased pension costs, deeper cuts are likely unavoidable to many programs, and the backlog is likely to increase. And rating agencies and bond markets may eventually force Illinois to change. And that would be an uncomfortable situation, to say the least, for everyone. And kind of the bottom line takeaway is that funding your priorities really depends on having a sustainable budget that raises the necessary revenues and makes the necessary resources available. So I will take it back over, give Paula the floor again, and hopefully we can get to some questions.
Thanks, David. I am open for questions here. You can use the screen, the far right-hand side. You have a box where you can type your question and we will answer it. Or you can email me at paula@voicesforkids.org, and we will take your questions that way. I don't have any questions lined up in queue, so if you ask it, you're likely to get it answered right away. So go ahead and send us our questions. And I wanted to let you know some additional housekeeping details. We will put this PowerPoint, we're recording it as we speak, so we'll put this. Okay. Let me just say, we'll put this recorded PowerPoint on our website so that you'll have access to it, and we will send that link around along with additional information on some of the proposals that David went through so that you're armed with information as you do your advocacy. And we will send that to everyone who is registered for the webinar. So we have some questions that we can throw out and ask right now.
Sure. Well, someone asked quickly about sequestration and how that will affect children in the state. While this presentation isn't specifically about sequestration, the sequestration will have a very negative effect on the state, both in terms of, a lot of the federal funding goes directly to kind of the end users of the programs or the end beneficiaries and bypasses the state budget. So those won't necessarily affect the state budget, but it will obviously harm the people who, get a reduced level of services. There will, overall, the cut will, the cuts are very significant and will grow over time. And I'm happy to talk with the person who sent that question in kind of offline. And I think, Larry, you might be a good person to answer this question. There was a question about the 100% funding cut in funding to the East St. Louis schools. That was part of the supplemental appropriation to the East St. Louis schools. Is that right?
I'm sorry. There was a supplemental for the East St. Louis school district that was meant to be a one-time payment because they're in such severe financial difficulty, and that was not included in the governor's FY14 budget.
I have a couple additional questions as well. So one of the questions is general fund transfers in particular. We would like our legislators to look at these. And I think that's a kind of a very important point. And we have additional information that we can send to people with a little more nuance about how to think about the general fund transfers and how to talk to your legislator about them. But we do think that particularly has legs for legislators that may be more hesitant to vote for tax increases. I think that's an important thing to talk with them about.
Although I would add that while the Fiscal Policy Center has for some time advocated scrutinizing statutory transfers out of the general funds. That doesn't necessarily mean anything resembling across-the-board cuts. What it means is looking carefully at each of them. They're in they're in the dozens, not in the hundreds, in terms of numbers. The largest transfers go to municipalities and to public transportation districts. And I would be careful about some of those. But there are other smaller ones which we think shouldn't exist at all. And some of them have, in fact, been eliminated, at least in the FY14 proposed budget.
There was also, we should keep in mind that, with the governor has proposed, several reduced transfers, and I see that there's a question or more comment relating to one of those particular funds that we don't necessarily take a position on whether one fund should be transferred, should have money transferred from it to the general funds or not. But we think it should be part of the overall budget discussion, and people should be looking at this 50% of the budget that is outside of the general funds that often kind of escapes. Isn't part of the discussion to the degree that it should be.
David, somebody made a really good point, more of a comment, but a really good comment that kind of plays out for those of us who are in Springfield and having these conversations regularly with legislators. And they made the caution that, for example, one of the cuts that we talked about was the cuts in transportation to the ISB budget, and that can be a really serious catch-22, particularly in more rural areas, spread out areas where transportation is a way to get services that they need. And so what are some of the ideas around that in terms of proposing alternatives? And what I take from that, very important comment is one of the things I think is very important for legislators to hear is for us as advocates to get out of our siloed approach to our advocacy and to really talk about the interconnection of these issues. So, cuts in an ISB line may affect DHS. Or if in ISB, if you're talking about cuts to early childhood block grant, that can also compound the effects of cuts to general state aid, because you're kind of pulling out the rug under from children, getting them ready to learn as they go into a district that may be seeing a $400 gap per pupil in the money they have available because of cuts to general state aid. So I think the more that we can talk about how these programs and services are interrelated, and I think that really does then push the point of, yes, you may just be on the Education Appropriations Committee, but we are watching what's happening with the Department of Human Services and the Human Services Appropriations Committee, and that really calls for some of these strategies like additional revenue so that the pie can be bigger for all of our priorities. Because it is very hard to say protect me knowing that someone else is not going to be protected. And so that's why we wanted to talk about some of these structural issues and really lay out a menu of options around expanding the pie that isn't just tax increases, but do include good ideas and also the repayment of bond restructuring so that human services can get, providers can get repaid.
And I see someone asked about HB 374, which is the debt restructuring bill, and how likely basically we think that is to pass. And I'm hesitant to kind of handicap these things, but it seems like there's a little bit of momentum behind it, which we'll see if it kind of comes to fruition. But we think it's a good idea, and have been calling for it for a long time to replace the unwilling lenders to the state with willing lenders to the state.
All right.
Yeah, I suppose I would say that it has a much better chance than previous versions that have been proposed because it's a much smaller amount of money. So 2 years ago, the governor proposed, I believe it was $8.7 billion, and this is $2.5 billion, and $1 billion of that would be for programs that are eligible for federal Medicaid reimbursement. So essentially, the state would be carrying debt service on only $1.5 billion rather than $2.5 billion. So it's much more manageable in terms of carrying the debt service, and it would also target the funding to service providers that have been hurt very badly by delayed payments over the past several years.
And I think we're about to wrap up here. If you have a question that you're thinking of that didn't get answered, please email me. I'm happy to answer it. For those of you who would like more specific information on particular line items that you're interested in, we can provide that to you as well. The purpose of this PowerPoint was to give more of an overview, but we have additional information that we can provide. And for those of you that want more information specifically on the fund transfers, we do have a fact sheet that lists some of the funds that, as Larry said, meet the criteria of having large balances year after year, and we can circulate that around as well. And again, this webinar will be in the narrated version, will be on our website, and we will send a link to that with additional materials to everyone who's registered.
Yeah. And I put my slide back on your screen, sorry, my email back on your screen. So it's dloyd@voicesforkids.org, and feel free to email us if you have any questions, and we'll try to answer the best of our ability. And thank you for joining us. Again, we'll try and keep you informed about the budget process as the kind of budget season wraps up over the next 6 weeks.
Absolutely, and I'm assuming that nearly all of the people, or most of the people who are listening to today's webinar, do get our e-alerts. But if you found out about the webinar through another network and you don't get our e-alerts, please sign up. We can send that link to you as well. It's easy to find on Voice's website. There's lots of good information. You'll continue to hear from us during the next, what will be pretty hairy 6 weeks, but when we all work together, we can make better outcomes for kids, families, and communities. So thank you very much for your time and attention this afternoon.